Sup guys, gonna quickly go over the new data mine today, starring Yorktown 2 and a couple of new planes. So right off the bat, being the rainbow carrier that she is, people will naturally try to compare her to Shinano and Haku. And she is definitely more similar to Shinano of the two, while Enterprise is probably closer to the Haku equivalent for USS. Just looking at her skills, you can see the similarities with Shinano, with a debuff that reduces the enemy's AA, a self-steroid, as well as a damage buff for other Yorktown and Essex classes. Before going into details about her skills, which are definitely weaker than Shinano's, it is important to note that because of her loadout, she will easily do more damage than Shinano against light armored enemies, and most likely win out comfortably against medium as well. My current impression is that if you're up against a light or medium armored enemy, then the pair of Yorktown and Enterprise will outdo Shinano and Haku since they can equip a lot more fighters. On the other hand, Shinano and Haku would do better against heavy armored enemies since they can equip much more torpedo bombers. It just so happens that we're currently in a period where both the meta and the Arbiter bosses are heavy armored, so you might see people doom post because Yorktown isn't going to be immediately good in those fights, but I think they'll quickly change their minds when a light armored boss comes by. Now, another thing that is worth mentioning is that Yorktown's second skill helps her recover her detection gauge, and the fact that even against heavy armored enemies, she still has to take fighters might mean that she'll be able to stay concealed longer than her competitors. A concealed airstrike deals probably at least 30% more damage than a non-concealed airstrike, so depending on how that actually plays out, she might be better even against heavy armored enemies that send planes out to detect your carriers. An example of this would be this month's Arbiter. So just to quickly summarize things again before we move on, Yorktown plus Enterprise best against light and medium armor enemies, Shinano and Haku best against heavy armor enemies. Next up is Hornet 2, who is a pretty simple ship. Her loadout is quite similar to Ticonderoga's, but her skill buffs are a little bit stronger. So she should be a really solid option against light and medium armor enemies, especially if they're a light cruiser or a light carrier. Next up is Northampton, who since her release, I've probably called her Southampton more times than Northampton, which is irrelevant to the data mine, but I thought I would share. She has a pretty solid stat line, and obviously comes with all the drawbacks of a heavy cruiser that I mentioned in my heavy cruiser tier list video. But fortunately, she's not just a stat stick, and similar to Baltimore, offers some pretty significant support for USS carriers. When you build a carrier fleet, you generally try to stack as many carrier buffers as you can in your vanguard, but if your carriers can't even reliably land those airstrikes, then none of those buffs matter at all. So her usage basically boils down to whether or not you need the slow, and if you do, then she is top priority, and if not, then you start considering other carrier buffers. Next up is Haman, who has a ton of utility. She's got air raid assist, flagship cover, decent AA, and a ghost anti-submarine mount, but all of this is held back by her absolutely atrocious stat line, so she does very little damage, and is very squishy as well. With all this utility packed in her kit though, she's far from unusable, so it's not too bad as far as purples go these days. And finally we have Langley 2, who is anyway, so we're moving on to the planes now, starting with the new F6F HVAR. This thing works the exact same way as the Ironblood rocket plane that we have currently, except its rockets are HE instead of AP, so they're skewed toward light armor. It's pretty simple. You just take this if you're against the light armor enemy, and you take the Ironblood one if you're against the medium armor enemy. Ideally, you'll probably want to farm 6 of these from D3. But remember to stay hydrated, take showers, and get some sunlight every day. And lastly, we have a new Rainbow Dive Bomber, which has a pretty different use case from Tenrise, so don't worry about all the plates that you spent on Tenrise. They did not go to waste just yet. Or maybe I'm just coping for myself. Anyways, this dive bomber only has 1 bomb but 8 HE rockets. The rockets are the same ones that are found in the HVAR, except there's 8 of them, so this is quite literally the strongest plane against light armored enemies on a per strike basis. It is very slow though, even compared to the Tenrai, so you'll probably have to drop one of your catapults for a beacon when you use this plane. Also, since it has a bunch of rockets, it's not as good against multiple enemies, and of course, not good at all versus heavy armor enemies. So, compared to the Tenrai, you would use this plane against any single target, light or medium armored enemy, and then you would use Tenrai for pretty much everything else. And that's pretty much it for this event. I hope that was somewhat informative, and I'll see you guys in the next one.